Welcome to Scripting for Creators. This will be a presentation that I will break up in a couple of places to take questions, so don't worry too much about death by PowerPoint. But this is scripting again from the creator's perspective, and I consider a creator a person that goes in there and builds experiences. I build experiences, and most of you in here do as well. This really isn't scripting for C# programmers, although I'd love to give a class, and maybe I will later. But the point is that I'm really trying to show how you use scripts inside of Sansar. And I'm going to go a little farther than just showing you the, here's how you configure a script, and it will do this. It's not just examples, although I'll show you where a bunch of examples are when I finish. The thing I'd like to do with this is basically have you get a little bit of an understanding, not too deep, but a little bit of an understanding of what's going on when you're writing a script or when you're using a script, so you can get a better feel for when you're configuring them, when they don't seem to work, why they may not be. You know, again, I'm trying to take away some of the mystery of what's going on behind the scenes. So you'll see a little behind the scenes of what's going on inside of Sansar when you're using a person's scripts. So let's start with, building an experience by a creator. And here's an example of a very simple experience that I just created. It was a simple scene, and I put in a doorway, which is a 3D model I brought in. I put a light inside of the doorway, and I put a trigger volume in the doorway. And so thought being here that you walk through the doorway, the light turned on, and it's about as simple as we can get. But again, it shows how scripting works. It's to provide interaction and changes in your scene from what you originally configured and saved. So if we look at that, the first thing that is in here is we're going to be talking about an object. Well, we all know we've seen objects before when we're building our scene. There's a window called Scene Objects, and everything we stick in the scene has a scene object associated with it. But there's a little more to it than it just being like a folder. Really, when you save a scene, each scene object, the server is creating a set of code associated with each one of those. The doorway's got a set of code, the plane does, the spotlight, the trigger volume, all has a chunk of code that has been copied from a template, we'll call it, which that code is called a class in C#. So it does what's called create an instance of a class. So basically it copies the generic code for an object to handle meshes and puts it in the doorway code. So I've got 6 pieces of code now running underneath this scene when I do the save. And that's important because, again, this is Sansar is built in C#, and it's object-oriented, and that's important in how you think about things, and you'll see that in the next few slides. So there's an object out there on the server, big deal. What does it have? Well, the thing that you most interact with currently is it's got variables or properties that contain the data that's used by the Sansar simulation. And what I mean by that is, it's got the position of let's say, the trigger volume or the doorway or the light. And you change X, Y position. You do it with the gizmo if you want to, but you can also do it by just typing values in the properties window for that doorway. And you can change those values. And what happens when you change those values and you save them, those are the values that are saved up on the server as well. So the server is keeping track of all those values. And in addition to those properties or values, it has methods and functions that can be called that query the state of the object, that causes the object to do something, and so on. So it's got properties, an object does, and it's got methods or functions. Now, then what's a script? Well, Linden Labs decided not to let programmers directly get into their server code. So they said, well, I'm not going to, even though that code is up there and I've just copied it over, we're not going to let you change that code directly. What they chose to do is let scripters extend the object's code with the code that the scripter writes. So what happens basically, let's say the light object, what they've allowed me to do is say, put a script, as you do, I put a script in the light, and then I write my code and I say, I want to extend the object, the light object. And by that means saying, hey, it's got its normal functions, but I want you to run this code, which can do various things. And the most obvious thing is I could change those property values, and so I could, change the color of the light. I could change the intensity of the light inside of the code, and it will change it at runtime. So rather than being limited to only changing it when I'm in edit mode, I can, with a script, change those values at runtime. And it could cycle through different colors. It could move an object in a circle. It could do all kinds of things. I wrote for example, I stuck a strobe light script inside of a light, and what it would do is it would turn on and off a light, 10 times a second, or however fast it did. Not that fast. But anyway, the point being is that scripts are tied to an object, and it allows me to change the properties of the object on the server, as well as call some functions, only the things that have been exposed. So let's talk about that real quick. When I'm saying that they expose certain properties and methods, they haven't given us everything. So for example, in the case of, let's say I wanted to move the light around, I can change its position, so I can make a light. I can rotate the light so it looks like a spinning light. I can't change the scale because they have not provided an API hook for changing scale. So the point being is you may not be able to do everything that you can in the properties window with a script. It's all what they have exposed. All right, let's talk about some basic rules for scripts and objects. Well, you place in an object the script, and it allows you to control aspects of how the object behaves in the simulation running on the client. So what's happening there is it means it allows me to change the properties like we talked before, for example, of the position or the rotation of a light. And then what happens is that gets sent down to the client, those positions do, and it gets sent down, certainly every frame. As you look at your frame rates, that's how often a server can be updating the client. What happens, though, the important part here is that the object that they're in, for example, the light object, you can only control that object. I can't, for example, stick a script in the trigger volume and say turn on and off this light over here. Doesn't happen because I can only control the trigger volume, or I can only, if I'm in the light, I can't play a sound. Well, that's obvious, but the point being is I can't control another light from inside of that light. The point being is it's limited in scope to that object, and that's all that the script can change is behavior of that object. Well, then how are we going to get this to work with the fact that you walk through a trigger volume and the light turns on? Well, scripts, you can't directly control the behavior of another object from a script inside a different object, but scripts can talk to each other. So one script can ask another script to perform a certain change in behavior. So for example, a trigger volume can have a script that sends a message when the avatar collides with the script, and that script can send the message, and the light can have another script in it that's listening for that message, and when it sees that message, it can change the values of the properties or variables in that class instance we talked about on the server and change the way the light from a different intensity or different color or whatever. So the point is, the light behavior is changed by the script in the light, but the request to change it is coming from the trigger volume with a script in it. The server then, of course, sends all that information down to the client, as we talked about, and the actual turning on and off of the light, as you see it, is being performed by the rendering down on the client, not on the server. So here's a simple diagram, and it's your most basic diagram that you see when you start programming. Basically, it's an input-output. So that's what happens. What happens is an input happens, a message gets sent, and an output receives that. Or in this, it may not receive it directly. It may be listening for it, and so it sees it drop somewhere. It may pick it up, like the idea of a post office box. This input often, as you'll see, I've got a couple of acronyms for it. In most programming circles, we call that a trigger and an event and an action. And you'll see us when we're talking about simple scripts mention them that way. In the Reflex framework, they call the input a sensor, the message is called a bang, and the output's called an actuator, but it really is just input, message, output, like anything else. Also, if you're going to apply some logic between the input-output, a typical approach to that is input processing output or input logic output, and with messages in between. So you send your input, sends a message to the logic that performs some amount of logic, and then it sends a different message based on what that logic told it to do to the output or action to be performed. And the Reflex scripts are really actually written that way, with sensor logic and actuator scripts been identified by Galen. In simple scripts, there is not a lot of logic scripts, or there's none that really was put out there by Kelly. And I think the reason for that is they're supposed to be starting scripts. They're supposed to give you an idea of how to go do things. And if you need logic, the point would be write your own logic scripts. I've seen a couple that have been released through the store just recently that are logic scripts. And certainly all the things that are in Reflex for logic scripts could be fairly easily rewritten as standalone modular logic, simple logic scripts, but no one's done that. And I think, again, the point being is, if you want to go ahead and have a logic script, just instead of configuring something, just go ahead and write a small script. That's easy to say and maybe hard to do. The other thing is, in the input and the output side, a lot of times when I'm writing code, I don't necessarily put a separate logic script. I'm not all that disciplined. I will put in the input side or the output side the logic I want to be performed, depending on what I need to go do. Like if I need a router, I would probably put that in the input side and send out 3 different messages to 3 different outputs, rather than having a standalone logic script and having to deal with that extra delay in messaging going through the message layer. So anyway, too much programming talk. So here's an example. I'm going to talk about simple scripts. Here's an example of a simple script with a trigger or input and an output and an action. It's a simple collisions, which is inside of the trigger volume. So when you walk inside the trigger volume, the on-agent collide will generate a message, and you type in that message, doorway in. And so when it's collided, a doorway in event is sent, and a simple light's been configured to listen for doorway in. So when that event happens, it goes ahead, and as you can see, it does mode A color when it sees doorway in, which is turn on a light that's red at intensity 60. Now, if I wanted to, I could have said, hey, when they leave the trigger volume, send a doorway out message, and I could have set mode B up to doorway out instead of off, like there, that's listening for, and set the intensity down to 0, so it would have turned off the light when I left the volume. But that's just an example of a simple script and how you configure it, and it's actually still going through all those steps that we talked about. The Reflex script looks a lot the same. Again, because it's input, message, output, except he calls them sensor, bang, and actuator. And again, the sensor script is dropped in the Reflex in the trigger volume, and the actuator scripts dumped or put in the light. And it sends, again, it's been programmed by Galen to, it doesn't send the doorway in message. What happens with the trigger volume is to send doorway in, and it automatically adds a colon on when you come into the trigger volume, and automatically adds doorway in colon off. It puts a colon off in when you leave the message, so it's not explicit like it was with the simple script message. So that is how that works, and that's important here that it does that. And also you'll see that there's also a new function called 0 and the transition seconds on the actuator. So you can set it to go, let's say, turn red and take 3 seconds to do it. Now, that brings up a good point, real quick here, that reflex scripts are different than simple scripts. Why is that? They have different functionality. For example, the way that the input in the reflex script, sends, does it says, hey, I'm going to send an in, I'm going to send the message with an in on and the message with a colon out, and that's what I'm going to do. Versus the other one allowed me to name the names of the script or the messages being sent when it collided and when it left. So again, it's just it's different. And also on the light side, if you remember, the simple script allowed me to control 2 lights, and I could have had a red and green light, but I could have chosen it to be a red and an off if I was listening to on and off messages. The point being there is Linden Labs has exposed their application program interface, a bunch of functions associated with objects, both on the input and the output side. And they said, here they are, and I as a scripter can code against it. And Kelly, looking at it, decided here's what a person would normally do when they wanted to interact with the trigger volume and what they wanted to interact with the light. And Galen looked at it and came up with a different set of things. He said, here's what people will probably want to do with the sensor and with the actuator. They both are calling the same code, and they both don't call every option that you've got available associated with lights and trigger volumes. But the point being, again, is that they were just at that point in time with that programmer decided people should interact with things. So I guess I just wanted to make that point that there's nothing magic going on. There's just, it's what that programmer decided, and you could probably, if you're writing your own or changing it, especially on the simple script side, you can just, add that functionality if you want, or if you needed it. And here's the third type. I just wanted to go over that real quick. Yep, they can talk to each other. So I can write an input trigger that's a simple script, and I can have an output actuator that is written in Reflex, and it can consume that message being sent. And it does it by prefixing the message name with a left bracket SS, right bracket colon. And that's basically, they're interchangeable. And you'll see later in the pitch that where I've gone ahead and took every portion of the input and output API provided by Linden Labs and provided examples for you to see how they work, both in simple scripts, reflex scripts, and hybrids of the two. So, what are the API triggers and actions? Here's all the things that you can do with input triggers. You can click your mouse on something, or use your VR triggers to interact with things. There's trigger volumes. There's colliding with objects. And colliding and trigger volumes both can be avatars or objects. Chat commands. You can issue chat commands, and it can listen for them. You can set up a proximity script that says, hey, is an actor close to this position? Is a object close to this position? Modal dialog, which is that little two option script that basically says, hey, here, throw up a menu that says where you can program 2 buttons, and based on what they click, execute some code. key press, which is your PC keyboard. So they've allowed you to click a number of keys and it'll respond to them with a script. Timer, which is strictly an input or a trigger, but can be set up as a trigger for for something to happen. But it'll be independent. You don't start by bumping a trigger. You have to start it some other way, like going through a trigger volume to start the trigger, and then the trigger can be sending something every few seconds or whatever, sending a message. And then HTTP requests, I've decided to call an input or a trigger. I can ask something from the outside world to happen. And the output action or actions that can happen is I can control the light, I can change the media. Now, change media doesn't really happen in the object. It happens at the scene level. And I just didn't want to get into a lot of detail. There are other things that they've exposed besides objects. They've exposed a very small amount of functionality at the scene level, of which the media override is the main one. I haven't seen how they can allow us to change skyboxes and so on, or audio streams, but you can change the media. But anyway, other object actions. You can play a sound or a stream. You can write chat messages to the chat box with a script. You can move an object. I can rotate an object. I can control the animation on an animated object. I can change the physics of the object so I can make it weightless. I can res objects from inventory on the fly. I can teleport. I consider those are all actions. And the last one I said is HTTP response. Something has to come back from your HTTP request, and I consider that an action. That's something that came back. Here's some things I'd like to see. And there's probably a page after page of these, but some of these are things that are already available in terms of I know they're in the simulation running on the server, but they haven't made them available to us. Some are things that aren't even made available, aren't even on the Sansar simulation running up on the server. But anyway, heads-up displays, I'd like to see as input. VR trigger release and mouse button release. Right now I can only see when they pressed it. And I'd like to be able to control the camera somehow and use that camera position as input to things in my scripts. Output actions, you can change. I'd like to see them change scale. I'd like to be able to change textures. I'd like to be able to control the flipbook playback. I'd like to be able to store persistent data on the server instead of out in the web. I'd like to override audio streams in addition to media. And I'd like to change some of the daylight and skybox things on the fly as well, fog. Okay, we're going to summarize this up real quick. Modular scripts that have been written, either in the Reflex framework or the simple framework, they wrap existing API functionality, and they wrap them differently. Each modular script author chose how they felt it was best to expose the functionality of the API. That means that they may both control light, but Galen chose something different than Kelly did in order for controlling that light. And if I was trying, there'd probably be a third version. So Reflex and simple scripts differ in the way they send and receive messages and what's in the message content. That's probably not all that important to you as a creator, but they do, and a lot of Galen's website, not a lot, but he's got a section on his website describing why he uses a different approach than Linden Labs do with Kelly. Basically, the difference is the Linden Labs approach in simple scripts uses something called a queue, which is kind of like a little database, and what happens is the script puts the input script puts a message out in that little database, and then the output script has said, hey, every time in this database you see this message, send it to me. So it's using that queue, that database, and the Reflex scripts uses something called a hub, which is a little more hardwired. What everything registers with the hub that's running in your server, in your experience, and running on the server, and then it kind of hard codes which messages go to which message, and so they can go a little bit faster. They don't have the delay of the queue. So again, you can read the Reflex documentation that says, here's why Galen thinks this is best. And Kelly will tell you it's going to the queue for a reason, it's so I can throttle, what's happening on that server, and for performance, make sure that you don't overrun the performance versus Galen had said, I don't want to be throttled with performance. If I want it to perform poorly or slowly because I got a lot of messages going through there, I would rather control it with my own code than the Linden Labs decision to throttle after a certain amount of messages go flying through that queue. Anyway, too much information. Simple script source code's available for you to modify. That's probably the most important. It certainly is for me. If you want to change or add features or apply logic on how these features are used. So every one of us that can script or that do script right now can take those and extend them and publish them and sell them if we want. Certainly it could mean a lot more. Scripting could be made available. We can't really do that with Reflex scripts right now. I can't extend them or change them. I can write a new one from scratch, and I have, just to better understand what Galen was thinking with his Reflex Hub. So you can write, I can write a whole new script that I have that worked as a new actuator and one that worked as a new sensor. And I'll be putting those out there as well. I can't call them Reflex scripts. I have to call them Reflex compatible, because Galen doesn't want to be people confusing my scripts with his. So my approach to this in most cases, and I probably will, the scripts I'm going to do as a new scripter, is I will have both sets of code in them, even though it's kind of heavyweight. Then you can turn them on and off. Do you want to use simple scripts? Do you want to use the messaging framework of Reflex? So they can easily work with each other. Although, quite honestly, Galen has written it in the Reflex side that it'll accept simple script messages. So really, you can stay in the whole simple script world, and as long as you don't care about it going through the queue for that tiny delay, you can interact with anything that's in the Reflex script world. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about was something that you probably expected to see when you came here. And what it is the fact that I have a new experience. It's called the Scripts Institute, and I hope I don't get sued. But it gives you the ability to look at all the input and output API input and output API, Linden Lab has exposed all those functions that I went over, and I have examples of them working. I have examples of them working as simple scripts or as Reflex scripts in the first floor. And in addition to having them working, much like if you've gone to Galen's demo area, you can see them working. It also has in a sign next to them, a sign showing you how they're configured in the background. So you can see, you can look at the configuration just like you did in the slides previously and say that I did in this presentation. Oh, that's how they work. That's how that message gets from here to there. Also, I explain on the slides what's happening, and I also have an audio. When you step next to the table, it's got the example. You'll hear Granddad Got Mojo drone on and on about how that example is working. So anyway, my whole idea of this is to start and put the beginning of a place where scripting is kind of the focus in this Scripts Institute. That's all on the first floor. And like I say, I've got 16 examples showing input and output API wrapped scripts, whether they be simple scripts or Reflex scripts, on how to configure them. The second floor is where I'm going to custom scripts, where I'm going to showcase them. I'm going to put all the ones I do. I release all my source code, so you can just use your source code. I have them out on GitHub, and I'll be giving links to where you can get all that if you're interested in actually looking at the code. And I encourage other programmers, whether they want to release the source code or not. I understand the need for not wanting to, because there's intellectual property. You don't want people stealing your code. But again, as I said before, I think I come from an open source community, and I see that you can release the code, and the I'm sure Linden Labs would, if you said, hey, they're selling my script with not changing it, they probably take it off the store. But anyway, the point being is you can still sell the code and people don't have to load it up and do all that kind of stuff. They can just buy it from the store, but you can still have the source code out there for people to go look at if they want to see how something's working and maybe use it as a starting point for their code that would do something different. The second floor, again, that's why I want to do those. So I encourage other scripters to do this with me, show their scripts. If nothing else, I may buy their scripts and just stick them up there. If they don't want to share how it's working, that's fine. But I'd like to have a place where you see how scripts are working. And I will certainly tell you what I understood about their script with a sign and configuring that and the different things you can do. The third floor, it's going to be dedicated to starting to learn to script. So if you really want to start to learn to script and you don't really have a big script background or programming background, maybe a little bit, I'm going to show you how to take custom scripts and change them and give you hopefully tips on how to go do that. And I'm going to, again, encourage a couple of the better scripting teachers here to maybe help me with that, because there's a couple guys, guys and gals, that I often, when I'm stuck, go to and they can help you. So the fourth floor is more advanced, so it's going to be where I'm going to go ahead and have talk about, how to build your own Reflex script if you want to, or custom script communication. I'm not going to, put screenshots of the code up there. You can get that off GitHub, but I am going to show basically how you can do those and some more of this type of presentation that gives you maybe a background on how to do it. And it's going to be aimed more for, hopefully, coming into Sansar will not just be builders, it will be people that actually program for a living. So it'll say, hey, you program for a living, or you program quite a bit, you're comfortable with programming, but you have no idea how to program things inside of Sansar. So that's I've never programmed a game before. I've written a ton of accounting software somebody might have done, but they have never programmed a game before and they want to learn how to do that. So that's my presentation. I hope to invite people to see the Scripts Institute, and wish you luck going through there.